Thank you very much, Jonathan. Jonathan Wittenberg is Senior Rabbi of Masorti Judaism UK and also co-founder of Eco Synagogue, and is talking today about ecology, the climate crisis, ecology and theology, and impassioned Jewish view. So thank you very much, Jonathan.
So thank you very much for having me. And I'm just going to introduce why I care about this subject and just appreciate the fact that people are spending their time at a difficult time in the world attending this talk. And I am sure that people have that everybody has their own strong motivations for being interested. So thank you. I've always been interested in the world around me. I've always loved nature. I grew up with a family who are gardeners. So hands-on, I've felt the soil change, the weather change, the way even in a very local area, nature seems to be working, the later fall of the leaves, the shift of the seasons. And I felt a great love for nature and a fear for its future. And that's motivated me to become more and more involved in environmental work and concern, trying to do it not just out of anxiety for the future, but also of sheer love of the world around us. And because as a religious leader, I find in it a source of sanctity, tranquility, beauty, and wonder. And I've also become aware that during lockdown, many people have indicated to me how they've re-evaluated the importance that the natural world has to them, both because we've come to understand more deeply how affected we are by it. If coronavirus is transmitted from animal to human, it reminds us that we're together on this planet and interdependent in ways we like and don't like. And also because it has been a balm to the soul in very troubling times and humbles us and opens the heart. So what I've done is focusing on Jewish sources, which to some people may be more or less familiar. I just want to begin with an attitude to creation and take us through specific Jewish commandments. That's the term one would use, what we understand to be God's will. It's expressed as mitzvah in Jewish terminology, concerning the world around us. And then to focus particularly on trees, which is a special love of mine. So I'm going to screen share because I think it's staring at a screen, at least there's something to look at, and hopefully this will work. And so do I have to press here to get it? There we are. So here's my title. And here, Hans Jonas was a Jewish moral philosopher. He fled Nazi Germany in 1931 and fought with the British Army in Palestine and elsewhere. Passionately anti-racist, became a moral philosopher teaching in New York. At the very end of his life, he went to Italy, where he was given a prize for translation of his essays. And this is the last lecture he gave. Everybody expected him to talk about racism and the Holocaust in which his mother perished in Auschwitz. He did not. This is 1991. He said as follows, and these words really, they sit with me. And I'm going to just read the second paragraph. The latest revelation from no Mount Sinai, from no Mount of the Sermon, from no bow tree, is the outcry of mute things themselves that we must heed by curbing our powers over creation. And that phrase, the outcry of mute things, is the title that was given to this essay because 3 days later he returned to New York and he died. So this is parting words to this world. And I'm not sure whether mute things are quite as mute as we think. I think nature turns out to have its voice in droughts and floods, in forest fires. But the mute things are, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book that really launched the environmental movement in America. It just seems to me such a powerful phrase. And the sense that this is a revelation, it opens our eyes and heart to what we need to be doing. So I just thought I would take something, seeing I did use the words climate emergency, which is although I'm not particularly associated with XR. It's their phrase. And here's a child's picture of Noah's Ark, and we love to think of the animals that are preserved. But there's an excellent, sorry, I need to find it, an excellent analysis of Noah's role by the biblical scholar Aviva Zornberg. And she notes that Noah obeys God, just getting the animals 2 by 2 onto the ark. What about everything else? What about the rest of creation? And she notes that Noah is silent. If we're any doubt about who Noah is, just consider the fact of his silence. He doesn't argue when he's told the world will be destroyed. He doesn't challenge in the biblical narrative when he's told, get on that boat. There's no sort of dialogue between him and all the people who are not going to get onto that boat. And André Neher, the French scholar, calls it unqualified apathy. And that it's a metastasis, it's a kind of sickness of his time. And I don't think we're being silent now in our time, because from the school strikes through to senior economists, business leaders, not to mention scientists, there is a real, the mute things are finding their voice within the human world. But the question is that voice strong enough to influence political will? So I'm now going to, that's by way of introduction, I'm now going to core Jewish texts. Often in environmental movements, the inverted commas, Judeo-Christian, in closed commas, tradition is blamed for telling us that we can have dominion over all the rest of the creatures of the earth, to do what we like with them, basically. But I want to put it that's absolutely not the view that comes through the Hebrew Bible, or indeed rabbinic thought. And that much more of a foundational text is the second chapter of Genesis, in which after creating Adam and Eve, by the way, I don't take these stories literally, I take them as truths in the sense that they teach important moral ideas, but not that they necessarily, or not that they did happen as the Bible says. The taking of the human being, which in rabbinic tradition, the first creature is male and female together, androgynous, and putting them in the Garden of Eden, which is a kind of metaphor for the whole of the world. The Hebrew then says le'ovda, which is usually translated as to work it, or le'shomra, to keep it. And on the right-hand side there, I've put an excellent analysis of these words, which I found in the work. I'll just give you the author. It's Ellen Davis, Scripture, Culture and Agriculture. She's, I don't know whether she's an Episcopalian or Protestant American professor of Bible and ecology at Duke University, an outstanding Hebrew scholar. And she noticed that the word avad in the Bible is rather diminished by translating it as work. That's a sort of, it's too mundane. The word also means to worship. It's the word used in Hebrew for the service of God. So to work the land and the garden of the world is also to show reverence for it, to treat it with respect, to understand our interdependence with it, even our dependence on it. There was a phrase in the Bible in Ecclesiastes, which I thought about again and again through the presidency of Trump, which is, even a king is subservient to the soil. I was kind of thinking, please remember that when you exit Paris. And I was really glad to see that Joe Biden signed an executive order and his first hour in office rejoining the climate lobby from Paris. And the word shamar is also reduced by just keep, as if, work it, make sure it doesn't degenerate. But actually to keep is usually used in the sense of to keeping God's law, keeping God's commandments. So it has a moral sense to it. It is a sense of, again, of respect and reverence. So if the earth belongs to, not to us, but it belongs, put it in different ways. It belongs to the future. It belongs to our children. It belongs to all generations. It belongs to God. Then to protect it, to preserve it, to treat it like something we are commanded to respect, is one step up from simply keep it, don't wreck it. It was actually in Oxford, now 2.5, 3 years ago, that I was part of a conference of alternative agriculture, and there was a session on spirituality and soil, and I was told, it was a multi-faith, and I was asked to speak on behalf of Judaism, and I was told this will be empty, and it'll be 5 or 6 people. The room was packed with people, many of whom were farmers, who said, and I do have a reverence for the land, and I want to develop that. So that's a core attitude, which is not just a Jewish attitude. I think it's an attitude in many faiths, but this is how Judaism would articulate it. Within that, Judaism has specific commands. The way Judaism works is it takes the language of the Bible, the core words from the Bible, and then it amplifies them through generations of rabbinic literature and lawmaking to specific actions. One of them is Bal Tashchit. Originally, it meant not destroying fruit trees around a city if you're at war with that city. You can't cut down the fruit trees because they give fruit. But it was expanded out and now is understood to be a general injunction to not to needlessly destroy. So it applies to everything from cutting down a forest for an unnecessary road. That's what a lot of people seem to think about HS2, to not using plastic cutlery and throwing it away every time. And so it's a very, very important principle, widely applied, domestically. Let churches and synagogues, we work together on this quite closely. When we serve meals, we shouldn't be using throwaways. That's wrong. When there's food over, it should go to food banks. When there's compostable waste, it should be composted. It should not go into black plastic bags. And as for plastic, it should be avoided wherever possible because of the destructive impact. So this is a very far-reaching, and it begins with those 2 words in the Torah. There's concern for animal life and a number of injunctions in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, about them. And they're generally expressed by the phrase, Sa'ar ba'alei chaim. It literally means the pain of living creatures. And it was Jeremy Bentham who said, the key fact about animals is can they suffer? And the answer is yes. I could have pulled a million pictures off the internet, but a picture that really influenced me, it's not this picture, is the picture of cows in transit to the slaughterhouse and a calf squeezed against the railings and actually weeping, or so it looked like weeping. And this actually addresses patterns of consumption throughout our world. And I'm a vegetarian person. I have to say I'm not a vegan, although I believe I should be, and I'm on that kind of journey because the dairy industry is not innocent either. But I'm not a campaigner, eat no meat, drink no milk. I don't think people, that simply pitching it in a way that gets at everybody is not helpful. Rather, we balance our diet with far less, which costs animal life and animal pain, and animal welfare is profoundly important. And this injunction goes back 2,000 years. Letting be. The Torah teaches that ultimately land belongs to God, even in our own country, even when the children of Israel reach their own land. But the 7th year, the land must be left fallow. And although that's been interpreted as in human interest, as a kind of utilitarian thing, we do this in order to get more out of the land the following year. It's good to let it be fallow or to have a rest. Actually, I find fascinating the bottom half of this. You can eat whatever the land during its Sabbath produces. There was slavery at that time, the laborers who live on it, your cattle and the wild beasts. In other words, fences must come down. And the meaning of this is mine is now limited and relative. It's part of mine, but there's a deeper ownership that isn't mine. And I need to allow everybody to benefit for a significant proportion from what I call mine. And I don't think the cutting edge of this has been sufficiently explored, but there's a deep relationship between our attitude to environment and and a kind of and colonialism, which is being pointed out as if to say, I am entitled to take as I want and as I can, and if I can pay for it, it is mine. Whereas there's something here much deeper saying you can't actually buy ownership, and land must be shared. I don't think this goes as far as we would want to go, and that's why fair trade cooperatives and similar are where one can, if one's able to buy and afford buying in those ways, I think one should. If one can't because one's hungry and struggling with one's children, then it's wrong to ask. But for those who can, it remodels what we understand by ownership, possession, and consumption. And social justice, that on our land we're not entitled to take everything. The olive trees are just one example, the corners of the fields, the gleanings, the forgotten sheaves, the fruit trees. You don't go over them a second time, as if to say, there are others here we need to share. And that's, that there are many ways in which this is practiced. I think now at this time, a lot of us have understood that if we're lucky enough to have food on our plates and a roof over our heads during lockdown, I actually wish the government would say to people who are able to, here's X on your pound tax to help the most vulnerable in our communities cope with the lockdown and the loss of jobs. It doesn't work like that, but we feel a duty to food banks and similar if we can. So there's specific commands within Judaism, and there are more. I haven't exhausted them. But overwhelmingly, there's the injunction to teach Torah, to teach to our children. How can we teach our children if we don't leave a livable world? So I look at my children and I think about this, and one wants to leave the world's children a world as biodiverse, as viable as our grandparents inherited, or indeed going back before them. And I'm going to take too much time. And here's a person. The picture is I think it's Uganda, but I may be wrong. But the text is an ancient text from the Talmud, so that takes us at least sort of 1700 years back. Why are you planting trees when you won't benefit from the fruit? I found a fruitful world because my ancestors planted it for me. I am planting for my children. And it's a responsibility towards the future which really motivates me, perhaps more than anything else. Now, just going to say something a little bit about trees. I've just got my eye on the time. Trees are also understood as the spiritual tree of life. It's an image in Judaism for the Torah itself, which is known as the tree of life, Eitz Chaim. And of course, that relates back to the tree of life planted in the Garden of Eden, and it becomes an important mystical idea. But I'll explain why I'm introducing it in a more kind of pragmatic and intellectual sense. A quote I love: "The world to come cares for this tree. This tree now has become a metaphor for the tree of life of all the world, that all living things are connected to one tree of life, watering it and preparing it through its work, crowning it with crowns, never at any time withholding its streams." One can take this image in many directions. The interconnectedness of nature. I think I also link it with social connection and justice, as well as environmental justice. Think of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham City Jail: "Injustice anywhere is a crime against justice everywhere." That's not quite accurate quotation. That we are part of the tree of life and dependent on each other and responsible towards each other. But oops, I've lost something I wanted to. I've obviously lost a text that I wanted to have there, so I'm going to have to do this from memory. It goes like this: the tree of life to the mystics is the same as the tree of knowledge. I think to many readers of the story of the Garden of Eden, they are different trees. In the middle of the garden is the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. But a careful reading of the text indicates that it can be the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the same tree. And to the mystics, the sin and I'll explain why this isn't just a recondite idea, but I think an important one, is the separation of the two of them. Knowledge becomes separated from the tree of life. An Oxford professor of philosophy, Professor Jeremy Nadler, alerted me in an article he wrote to how he understands that. He didn't actually use that text from the Zohar, but as the development in the early, in the kind of the pre-Enlightenment, and he particularly mentions Francis Bacon, of knowledge ceasing to be about developing our understanding of the world so that we can show greater reverence and awareness, an attitude which many scientists and ecologists do hold. And instead of that becomes the notion that knowledge is power, knowledge is control. It's the capacity to stand back and order, organize, and control. And I think that phrase, knowledge is power, sums it up. And the danger is then that when the tree of knowledge is separated from the tree of life, the purpose of knowledge is no longer to nurture the tree of life and protect it, but to control it. And that's the direction which our civilization has gone and which we have to review and revise. So that's a more kind of spiritual, mystical idea. But I think that issue, what am I using knowledge for? What are we using our skills, capacities, power for? Is a fundamental question to be asked at every level, personal, political, economic, urgently now. At the end of this, I've put two organizations I'm very involved in. I was co-founder of Eco Synagogue. We developed it off the back of Eco Church. We learnt from and worked with and obtained support from and permission from Eco Church, which now has 3,000 churches. It's a careful environmental audit, and we're just relaunching the Eco Synagogue audit, which takes communities and their members through a very, very careful analysis of all areas of activity and how we use energy, how we teach and preach, how we use food, how we travel. There's very, very little about which questions aren't asked. And then there's a process also of finding the resources to change our carbon footprint and engage more deeply with the earth around us. And part of that project is a tree planting project, which we've called J-Tree Global. I'm going to close there. I'm going to try to unscreen share and see if people have got questions.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Jonathan. And I certainly have that certainly brought some questions into my mind, but I'd like to let other people have a chance first, as it were. So if people have questions, could you please either put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I can probably work out how to unmute you. Perhaps while people are thinking about that, I wonder if you could perhaps say a little bit more about the contemporary involvement of the Jewish community in the environmental movement, because you've said a bit about Eco Synagogue. What's your experience been as having worked with the Jewish community, but also worked with people of other faiths and of no faith, with the involvement of the Jewish community in those issues?
I think the Jewish community in this country is a bit late on board. And it's getting moving only now. The Jewish community in America has been much ahead of it. It established an excellent environmental organization called Chazon, means vision, I guess 20 years ago now. And that has farms, meditations, community groups across the United States. And there's been no organization like it here. There's a huge number of Jewish charitable organizations, a lot of them concerned with social justice, human rights, poverty, but we've been later, but we are now moving, but it's late in the day. In terms of other faiths, The Church of England, I think, has been very impressive over the last few years. I'm quite friendly with the Bishop of Salisbury, who's the lead, who's been the Church of England lead on this. And particularly in terms of divestment from fossil fuel industries and the movement of very, very substantial funds towards renewable, circular economy, or the saying to companies and businesses, we'll work with you over the next few years to help develop change, but if you don't, we will withdraw our fund. So that, I think that's been apparently it's mobilized something like $9 trillion across the world. I have no idea whether that's a lot of money or not in this scale. It certainly sounds like a hell of a lot. There's also Faiths for the Climate and a lot of interfaith work. The previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, has been a superb leader of this in a very, very significant voice. But most significant of all has been the Pope with Laudato Si. That's I very, very found that very, very moving encyclical. It's now 5 years on. I reviewed it. I gave a Jewish review of it actually for the Times when it came out. And it was very deliberately addressed to all faiths and to different corners of the world, and quoted bishops from all parts of the globe. The challenge is there's a feeling that among Catholics, I understand, that it hasn't really been acted on. Okay. And now there's a 5-year conference coming up, especially with Italy and Britain co-hosting COP26 this autumn. So the Vatican's very involved. And one of the issues being discussed is, okay, there's the theology. How do you turn that into practical action at the level of local community? It's exactly that which eco-church and eco-synagogue and such sort of audits are intended to address. And also the leadership in this country and in Italy of COP26 has understood that faiths have an important role to play. That 80% of the world's population have a faith, that 15% of the world's lands are either owned or farmed by faith communities. I believe a huge number of educational institutions are faith-led, and that faith, economics, law, politics, science need to go together.
I think that's very much what one of the reasons we wanted to have this season being creation justice was that idea of trying to expand the way that we look at, and actually the quote you gave about eco-synagogue, expand the way we look at the environment and the climate from a sort of scientific question to being a holistic question of, of values and of our choices as communities. And I think that picks up actually something that we were talking a little bit about before we started formally and started recording, which is sort of how you motivate people and how you present these topics in a way that is inspiring rather than off-putting for people.
It's very, I mean, that is really challenging, and I'm aware that people don't want to hear, that people can feel saturated with bad news about the environment. During the last year, as well as a year of COVID, the fires in Australia, in the west of the United States, there's disaster all around and a sense of the diminishing of species and so on. That's one of the reasons I started J-Tree as a tree planting project. And reading, I mean, I kind of belong to WWF and to the Royal Society for Protection of Birds and Impassioned in World Farming and other organizations. And when I read their magazines, they're careful to balance positive contributions that are being made with not withholding some of the really difficult news. And I think people want to know, wherever possible, that one can make a creative contribution in a compelling way, and not just be told, well, this is what you can't do. And people also want to have thoughtful alternatives. So, like, a member of my community is developing alternatives to single-use plastic, based on sustainable production of seaweed. So one wants to have can-dos and not just can't-dos.
Thank you.
No, thanks, Rabbi Jonathan, for your presentation. I wanted to ask something that is a bit related, which is you talked a bit at the start about balancing love and enjoyment of nature with being more motivated by anxiety for the future. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that from a personal perspective, because I know for me that that this anxiety about nature and preserving nature for the future can have an impact on that enjoyment. I mean, for example, watching a wildlife documentary and learning about animals and the wider world around used to be something that I would find very enjoyable and nourishing, but now it's tinged with this sense that we're destroying the natural world and this anxiety. So how you can balance those things in the work that you do?
So, I mean, that's really important, and it's difficult to respond to. You asked me to say something a bit, personal about it. So I notice these things we're lucky to have a big garden. So I notice them just in feeding the birds. It's a very local wildlife thing, but suburban gardens have become a prime important habitat for a lot of birds. And when I don't see like the blackbirds in this garden, they come and go. When I don't see them for a couple of weeks, I really worry. Have they gone forever? Where are they? Has a cat got them in the neighborhood? But have they just gone? Have they withdrawn? I mean, the goldfinches, I haven't seen them for a few weeks. So now this may just be they've gone somewhere else, prefer somebody else's bird feeder, but actually the starlings have gone. And the numbers of species change. They're not all going down. Sparrows are making a comeback. Woodpeckers are doing great. It's not all bad news, but some of it is. So I see it in the enjoyment and I see it in the absence. So it's very, very local. It's very, very immediate. I'm sure that's magnified if I was to look at the state of things, in many other parts of the world. If one looks at big game and big cats, rhinos, elephants, it's extremely disturbing about what the sheer numbers of human population have done to habitat, and also the cruelty of the poaching industry. So sometimes I dare not even read things that I've got. I have to take it in measure. And I think that's why I think it's extremely important to balance it with positive action. This is something I can do and will do something about. I've decided I want to be responsible for planting a tree for at least one tree every month for the rest of my life. Not with my own hands. I'd love to do something with my own hands, but through organizations that are responsible. So I think balancing what we witness with what we do is really important. Also, it's very, very important to speak about the beauty of nature and the enjoyment of nature and encourage children to know it, because it's knowing the love of it that makes one want to protect it. And a lot of tree planting schemes in this country are community-based for that reason. I don't know whether that's at all a satisfactory. It's a bit rambling answer. I don't know whether.
Yeah. I think I think it's very interesting what you say, and it also maybe I'll pause in case someone else wants to ask a question.
I think it's okay to continue. I can't see any hands up in the. Sorry, go on.
Do carry on, because I can't see anyone else's hand up. So do go on.
I was just your answer reminded me also of debates in the Bay Area where I was studying for my PhD about eucalyptus trees and about invasive or non-invasive species and how to think about nature around us, and what you were talking about with various species of birds making a comeback or their numbers going down. so on, that there's a debate between people who see these big, beautiful trees and think we should fight to preserve them, and people who see them as an invasive species that's preventing the more natural other species of tree in the area from growing. And what you were saying as well about suburban gardens, and I guess finding a way to balance what's now the way that children can appreciate nature, which is more likely to be from a suburban garden with birds that may be relatively new species in that area, compared to the same sorts of natural landscapes that our grandparents may have seen, and how to sort of bring that into our understanding of the natural world.
I guess we have to focus on what's accessible and local to us and to children. It was interesting that I was on in a session in which the local mayor was speaking, and she said, this is North London area of Barnet, and she was saying that she had a lot of interest in locality, which she hadn't experienced before, because large numbers of people who would commute daily into town were now unable to do that, and therefore they noticed things around them which they'd just walked past and scarcely taken in before. And that awareness had led them to ask, well, what can we do about this? And it was a reevaluation, really. And one of the things I hope that won't be lost after lockdown, there's a lot we don't want to repeat, is a greater awareness of nature immediately around us, and less of a sense of entitlement. But entitlement does not apply to everybody. There's plenty of people who are entitled to things. They should be entitled to things they can't access at all. But there's also, I think, quite a lot of Western or Northern culture that is about a sense of entitlement. I have this by right, and actually giving the money confers on me moral right to it. And these things need to be brought into question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wondered if you just had time for one final question, because I think one thing that is a challenge for a lot of people in engaging with these questions is can we make a difference as individuals? How does what we do make any kind of difference? And one of the, if this was something I also brought up with the first speaker that we had in our sermon series, a woman called Ruth Valerio. So she's writing.
Oh, indeed. She's the person I worked with Eco Synagogue and Eco Church. I know her very well.
Yeah, marvelous person. And she was saying that, essentially from a faith perspective, that kind of utilitarian question of, am I making any difference? Kind of, you can put that worry to one side in a way and say, well, you need to be doing what is right because you want, to be a good person. You want to have that integrity of doing the right thing, regardless of whether you are making a difference on that global scale. I wondered if you had anything to add to that or to contribute to that in terms of how we overcome that sense of, well, nothing I do as an individual is going to make any difference.
So first of all, that is an argument one hears a lot. When countries are opening new coal burning power stations, what? And I think it's quite interesting that I think what's going to turn the tide, if anything does, will be economics. That it's no longer worth investing in those industries because they haven't got. So, but first of all, I agree with you that there's a kind of moral and spiritual integrity by doing what's right and not what's wrong, and not by saying, I'll do what's wrong because it doesn't really make a difference, so I'll do what's wrong. That doesn't make sense morally. But I think there's a different argument as well, which is if one wants to, as I do want to, be able to talk to members of parliament and business leaders and people who have a degree of power to change policy, but I lack the integrity of trying to do any of this in my own life, what moral right do I have to challenge them? That's one part of it. The other is, I'm asked a senior civil servant in my community, what really influences politicians? And her answer was, when significant numbers of ordinary people, not sort of people considered and defined rightly or wrongly as radical, do something or care about it. And so grassroots in a democracy, grassroots action, consumer change, behavior change, voices do in the end influence politics because they have votes. So I think there are a number of reasons why it's important to act. And if everybody says, I'll leave it to somebody else, that's for sure a recipe for disaster. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, Jonathan. And
nice to meet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you.